When tech billionaire Victor Ashworth publicly humiliated a quiet black woman at his exclusive charity gala, he thought he was untouchable. But Destiny Clark wasn't just any woman. She was someone whose true identity would bring his empire crashing down and expose secrets he'd buried for decades. Get ready for a story of karma so powerful it will leave you speechless. If you love seeing justice served, smash that like button and let's dive into a tale that proves the universe has a way of balancing the scales. Picture this: the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, dripping with crystal chandeliers and filled with the kind of people who measure their worth in zeros. This wasn't just any fundraiser. This was Victor Ashworth's annual charity gala, where the tech billionaire played king for a night, surrounded by politicians, celebrities, and anyone desperate enough to kiss his ring for a piece of his fortune. Victor stood at the center of it all, his perfectly tailored tuxedo unable to hide the arrogance that oozed from every pore. At 52, he'd built a tech empire worth $12 billion. But money hadn't bought him humility. If anything, it had amplified his worst traits: his need to dominate, his hunger for control, and his belief that everyone around him existed solely for his amusement. The evening was going exactly as Victor had orchestrated. Senators laughed at his mediocre jokes, supermodels posed for photos at his side, and the media captured every moment of his manufactured generosity. He was holding court near the auction stage when she walked in. Destiny Clark moved through the crowd with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from inner strength rather than external validation. She was stunning. Marshawn was stunning, not in the flashy way that demanded attention, but in a way that drew your eyes and held them. Her dress was elegant but understated, her jewelry minimal, her smile warm but cautious. She looked like she belonged in rooms like this, yet something about her suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. Victor noticed her immediately, but not for the reasons you might think. His predator instincts kicked in as he watched her navigate the crowd. She wasn't fawning over him like the others. She wasn't even looking in his direction. And that, to a man who believed the world revolved around him, was unacceptable. What happened next would haunt Victor for the rest of his life, though he didn't know it yet. He approached Destiny with the swagger of a man who'd never been told no, his entourage trailing behind him like loyal dogs. "Excuse me," Victor said, his voice carrying that particular brand of condescension reserved for people he considered beneath him. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Are you with the catering staff?" The ballroom didn't fall silent. Conversations continued around them, but something in the air shifted. Destiny turned to face him, and for just a moment, Victor caught something in her eyes. Not fear or embarrassment, but something deeper. Something that should have warned him he was making a terrible mistake. "No," Destiny replied simply, her voice steady and clear. "I'm a guest." Victor's laugh was sharp and cutting. "A guest at my gala?" He looked around at his circle of sycophants, making sure they were witnessing his performance. "Forgive me, but I personally approved every name on tonight's list. I think there's been some confusion." The humiliation was surgical in its precision. Victor had perfected this technique over decades. The public questioning, the implied accusation, the systematic destruction of someone's dignity while maintaining plausible deniability. He wasn't being openly racist, but everyone in earshot understood exactly what was happening. "Perhaps you're thinking of the community outreach dinner next month?" Victor continued, his smile never wavering. "That would be more appropriate for someone like you." Destiny stood there, absorbing every word, every slight, every cutting implication. Her hands remained steady at her sides, but those who looked closely might have noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. Not from hurt, but from something that looked at almost like recognition. "You know what?" Victor said, pulling out his phone with theatrical flair. "Let me call security. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding, but we can't be too careful these days." What happened next was masterful in its restraint. Instead of causing a scene, instead of defending herself or fighting back, Destiny simply nodded. She looked directly at Victor, really looked at him, as if she were memorizing every detail of his face. "You're absolutely right," she said, her voice carrying a weight that Victor was too arrogant to recognize. "I clearly don't belong in your world." She turned to leave, but then paused, looking back over her shoulder with an expression that would later keep Victor awake at night. "You have no idea who you just dismissed, Mr. Ashworth, but you will." Security never came. Destiny walked out on her own, leaving behind a room full of uncomfortable guests and one very satisfied billionaire. Victor basked in the moment, accepting congratulations from his inner circle for handling the situation so smoothly. "You can't be too careful," he told a senator's wife. "These people will try anything to get close to real money." But as the evening wore on, something nagged at Victor. It wasn't guilt. He was incapable of that level of self-reflection. It was something in Destiny's voice, in the way she'd said his name, in the absolute certainty of her final words. For just a moment, doubt crept in. Then he pushed it away, returning to his world of artificial praise and manufactured importance. What Victor didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Destiny Clark wasn't just any woman seeking to crash his party. She was someone whose entire career had been built on bringing down men exactly like him. For the past 18 months, Destiny had been conducting the most thorough investigation of her career. As a forensic financial analyst specializing in corporate fraud, she'd made a name for herself by following paper trails that others deemed too complex or too dangerous. Her reputation was built on patience, precision, and an almost supernatural ability to connect dots that others couldn't even see. But this case was different. This case was personal. 15 years earlier, Victor Ashworth had been a rising star in the tech world, hungry for his first major acquisition. He'd set his sights on a small but innovative software company in Oakland called Meridian Tech, owned by Destiny's father, Robert Clark. What should have been a straightforward business deal became something far more sinister. Victor had made an initial offer that Robert rejected, not because it was too low, but because he'd heard rumors about Victor's business practices. He didn't want his employees, many of whom were like family to him, to suffer under Victor's notorious cost-cutting measures. That's when Victor showed his true colors. Instead of negotiating fairly, he launched a systematic campaign to destroy Meridian Tech. He spread false rumors about the company's financial stability, poached key clients with predatory pricing, and even had his lawyers file frivolous patent lawsuits designed to drain Robert's resources. The attack was relentless and calculated. Within 8 months, Meridian Tech was bankrupt. Robert Clark lost everything: his company, his savings, his reputation. The stress destroyed his marriage and his health. He died of a heart attack 2 years later, a broken man who never understood why he'd been targeted with such viciousness. Victor bought Meridian Tech's assets for pennies on the dollar and absorbed their technology into his own products. It was the foundation of his first billion-dollar breakthrough. He'd built his empire on the grave of Robert Clark's dreams. Destiny was 22 when her father died, fresh out of graduate school with a degree in forensic accounting and a heart full of rage. She watched her father wither away, saw how the systematic destruction of his life's work had killed his spirit long before his body gave out. At his funeral, she made a promise that would define the next 15 years of her life. She would learn everything there was to know about corporate fraud. She would become the best investigator in the field, and someday she would make Victor Ashworth pay for what he'd done. But Destiny was smart enough to know that revenge served hot leads to prison. She needed to be patient, methodical, and absolutely certain that when she struck, it would be devastating and completely legal. So she built her career. She took down executives at Enron's subsidiaries, exposed fraud at pharmaceutical companies, and helped prosecutors send dozens of white-collar criminals to prison. With each case, her reputation grew, and with each case, she honed her skills for the one target that truly mattered. 3 years ago, she'd finally gathered enough evidence to begin building a case against Victor. What she discovered was breathtaking in its scope. Meridian Tech wasn't his only victim. It was a pattern that had repeated dozens of times over 2 decades. Victor would identify promising smaller companies, make lowball offers, and when rejected, systematically destroy them before acquiring their assets. But this time was different. This time, Victor had gotten sloppy. His charity foundation, the same one hosting tonight's gala, wasn't just a tax haven. It was a sophisticated money laundering operation that funneled profits from his acquisitions through fake charitable causes and back into offshore accounts. Destiny had the paper trail. She had the bank records. She had testimony from former employees. She had everything she needed to bring down a billionaire. The invitation to Victor's gala had come through official channels. The charity's board of directors, unaware of Victor's illegal activities, had invited her as a respected member of the financial community. They'd wanted someone with her reputation present to lend credibility to their cause. Victor's head of security had approved her background check without question. Destiny Clark, forensic accountant, clean record, substantial charitable contributions. He never connected her to Robert Clark or Meridian Tech. Why would he? That was ancient history, a footnote in Victor's rise to power. Destiny had attended the gala with one simple goal: to look Victor Ashworth in the eye before she destroyed him. She wanted to see the man who'd killed her father, wanted to understand what kind of person could systematically destroy lives and sleep soundly at night. What she hadn't expected was for him to make it personal all over again. As she sat in her car outside the Meridian Hotel, Destiny felt the weight of 15 years of preparation settling on her shoulders. Tomorrow the story would break simultaneously in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the Financial Times. Federal investigators were already preparing arrest warrants. The IRS had frozen the charity's accounts pending investigation. Victor's humiliation of her hadn't changed her timeline. It had simply added one more crime to a very long list. But it had done something else too. It had shown her, with crystal clarity, that the man who destroyed her father was exactly who she'd always believed him to be: a small, petty tyrant who used his wealth to crush anyone who didn't bow before him. The first story broke at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. Tech billionaire's charity foundation exposed as money laundering scheme, read the headline in the Wall Street Journal. By 6:30, Victor's phone was ringing off the hook. The article was devastating in its detail. 23 pages of meticulously documented evidence showing how Victor had used his foundation to hide hundreds of millions in illegal profits. Bank records, witness testimony, email chains, everything laid out with surgical precision. But that was just the beginning. At 7 a.m., the Washington Post published their piece, "The Predator Pattern: How Victor Ashworth Built His Empire on Corporate Corpses." This one detailed his systematic destruction of smaller companies, complete with interviews from dozens of victims and their families. By 8 a.m., the Financial Times had released their investigation into his offshore accounts and tax evasion schemes. By 9 a.m., federal agents were raiding his offices in Silicon Valley, New York, and Miami. Victor watched his world implode from his penthouse apartment, his lawyers screaming at him through speakerphone as his stock price went into freefall. In 4 hours, he'd lost 60% of his net worth. By market close, it would be 80%. But the financial losses were nothing compared to what came next. It was Victor's head of security who made the connection first. He was reviewing the guest list from the previous night's gala, trying to understand how a financial journalist had gotten close enough to the boss to cause problems. "Sir," he said over the phone, his voice tight with something Victor had never heard before. "Fear. That woman last night, Destiny Clark. Her father was Robert Clark, Meridian Tech." The phone slipped from Victor's hand. Meridian Tech. The name he'd tried to forget. The company he'd destroyed so long ago it felt like another lifetime. He remembered Robert Clark, a decent man who'd stood in his way, who'd chosen principles over profit. Victor had crushed him without a second thought, the way he'd crushed dozens of others. But he'd never known Robert had a daughter. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The woman he'd humiliated, the woman he'd dismissed as a nobody trying to crash his party, she was the architect of his destruction. She'd spent 15 years preparing for this moment, building her reputation and gathering evidence while he'd forgotten she even existed. Victor sank into his leather chair, understanding for the first time in his life what it meant to be completely outmaneuvered. Every move he'd made, every cruel word he'd spoken, every ounce of arrogance he'd displayed, it had all been observed and cataloged by someone with both the skill and the motivation to destroy him. The woman who'd stood there with such quiet dignity as he tore her down in public wasn't some random party crasher. She was the daughter of a man whose life he'd ended, and she'd just returned the favor. The arrest came on a Wednesday morning. Victor was still in his penthouse, surrounded by lawyers and crisis management specialists, when the FBI knocked on his door. The charges were overwhelming: money laundering, tax evasion, wire fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. As they let him out in handcuffs, past a crowd of photographers and reporters, Victor caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Destiny Clark stood on the sidewalk across from his building, not gloating or celebrating, just watching with the same quiet intensity she'd shown at the gala. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Victor saw something there he finally understood: justice. Not revenge, not cruelty, but the cold, patient justice of someone who dedicated her life to righting a terrible wrong. In that moment, Victor Ashworth, billionaire, power broker, destroyer of dreams, finally understood what his father had tried to teach him decades earlier: that every action has consequences, and those consequences don't always arrive on your timeline. The federal case against Victor was ironclad. Destiny's evidence was so comprehensive, so meticulously gathered and documented, that even his army of high-priced lawyers couldn't find holes in it. The prosecution offered him a deal: plead guilty to all charges and serve 15 years in federal prison, or go to trial and face the possibility of life behind bars. He took the deal. Victor's conviction sent shockwaves through Silicon Valley and beyond. His business empire, built on a foundation of fraud and destruction, collapsed within months. His remaining assets were liquidated to pay restitution to his victims, including the families of the companies he'd destroyed. The Meridian Tech Victims Fund, established with Victor's seized assets, distributed over $200 million to the employees and investors who'd lost everything when he'd systematically destroyed their company. Robert Clark's elderly widow received a settlement that allowed her to live comfortably for the rest of her life. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the broader investigation that Destiny's work had triggered. Federal prosecutors, armed with her research methods and inspired by her results, launched similar investigations into dozens of other tech executives. The Ashworth effect, as journalists called it, led to the largest crackdown on corporate fraud in Silicon Valley history. Destiny herself became something of a legend in her field. Speaking requests poured in from law schools, conferences, and corporate governance seminars. But she turned most of them down, preferring to let her work speak for itself. 2 years after Victor's sentencing, Destiny stood in the lobby of the new Meridian Memorial Business Center in Oakland, a facility for entrepreneurs and small business owners, funded by the recovered assets from Victor's empire. A small plaque near the entrance read, "In memory of Robert Clark and all those who dared to dream." She thought about that night at the Meridian Hotel, about Victor's sneering face as he dismissed her, about the satisfaction in his voice as he'd called her people and suggested she belonged somewhere else. She thought about her father, who died believing that bullies like Victor Ashworth always won in the end. He'd been wrong about that. The truth was, karma isn't some mystical force that strikes randomly from the universe. Sometimes karma is a daughter who refuses to forget, who spends 15 years becoming everything she needs to be to balance the scales. Sometimes karma is patience, preparation, and the absolute certainty that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Victor Ashworth had built his empire on the belief that wealth and power made him untouchable. He'd crushed dreams and destroyed lives with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. But on one crystal-clear night in a hotel ballroom, he'd made the mistake of dismissing the one person who had the power to bring his world crashing down. He'd looked at a quiet black woman and seen someone he could humiliate for sport. What he'd actually seen was justice, dressed in an elegant gown and waiting patiently for her moment to strike. And that's how Destiny Clark brought down one of the most powerful men in Silicon Valley. Not through violence or illegal revenge, but through patience, preparation, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Sometimes the universe doesn't serve karma fast enough, so exceptional people step up to lend it a hand. If this story of justice served cold inspired you, hit that subscribe button for more incredible tales of karma finding its way. And let me know in the comments, what would you have done in Destiny's position? Could you have waited 15 years for the perfect moment to strike? Remember, in a world where the powerful often prey on the powerless, sometimes it takes someone exceptional to remind us all that actions have consequences. And those consequences always come due in the end. This story serves as a reminder that underestimating someone based on their appearance or background can be the most expensive mistake of your life. Power and wealth mean nothing when facing someone with the patience to build an airtight case and the skill to bring giants to their knees.